This people, I am Syed Shabahat and you're watching Fault Lines. It has been 28 days on invasion on Gaza. Aerial bombardment has taken more than 8,000 lives, half of which are children. We are seeing footages of innocent children dying and crying in the hospitals, and the entire international community is a mere speechless bystander. In today's program, we are going to seek answers of some very pertinent questions. And the questions are, what Brazil is trying to seek at the UN with regards to this conflict? Is United States actually interested to bankroll this act of genocide, this largest war against innocent children of Gaza? And is there a difference between killing Hamas and killing the innocent people of Gaza? Or have these two terminologies been mixed deliberately to justify what is happening in Gaza? But before we proceed with our guest lineup, here is my take for today's program. Every media house is starting the story from the condemnation of Hamas's attack on Israel. Yet no one wants to stop the killing of small children dying in the aerial strikes. City of Gaza, surrounded by IDF for a major ground assault, is expecting the entry of tanks and large number of Israeli soldiers at any point. 8,000 plus people have died so far in 6,000 air strikes, out of which half are children. The largest act of genocide under the watch of US naval fleet, which is there to ensure no one from the outside reaches to help the Gazans. Even United Nations has not been able to cease fire or not been able to provide humanitarian supplies to the extent to which it is needed. Ground troops may expand the war inside Lebanon anytime. Ladies and gentlemen, to talk further about these very pertinent issues, my first guest is joining me from New York, and he's a professor. His name is Professor Beniam Awash, an assistant professor at State University of New York. Professor Beniam Awash, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor, Israel act of self-defense or Israel act of brutality against innocent people of Gaza. These two terminologies have been deadly intermixed by the international media outlets. Help us to understand as a professor.
The horrific acts of October 7 that initiated the current round of war in the Palestinian occupied territories and with Israel has been really also a war of narratives and framing. And so one of the consistent techniques that we see of framing is to always begin an interview with a loaded question, which is, do you condemn the acts of Hamas as terrorist? So it already does two things for us. One, it depoliticizes the conflict. And second, it takes it out of any type of historical context, as if there was no violence, no killing, no occupation, no land dispossession that has been happening for over 70 years. And so when war happens, the first casualty is truth. And that's what we see being witnessed. And the second thing, aside from depoliticization and dehistoricization, which means no context whatsoever for viewers to understand why the violence is happening and how to understand it. And the second aspect is a process of dehumanization. And so if you look at the way in which the group, organized political group and armed group Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other resistant groups within Palestinian occupied territories are depicted as equivalent to Palestinians, broadly speaking, civilians. So children, mothers, fathers, etc., are depicted as one and the same, as combatants, as fighters. And that makes it very problematic because, again, the second thing that you're looking at is this process of dehumanization. And you see that in the constant reference, by the way, to Palestinians as animals, right? So it not only goes beyond simply conflating a organization, an armed group, and a political organization, Hamas, with a population, but it also conflates again the idea that this cultural group, these Palestinians, are not human, right? Are broadly constructed as terrorists.
So what has been the United Nations role at large in this crisis? Do you believe it has catastrophically and miserably failed to stop this act of genocide?
So if we look back after October 7th, so for the past 20 odd days, the Gaza Ministry of Health, a very reliable source of data, has pointed out that there's over 8,000 civilians, Palestinians, that have been killed. And out of those 8,000, about 50% are children. So 3,100, 3,200 are children. So in this context, the National Security Council member John Kirby from the United States indicated that the official position was to have no ceasefire, to continue this process of killing. The UN, represented by the UN General Secretary, in a very sort of precedented sort of act, um, made a statement on the same day, October the 24th. One, he called for an immediate ceasefire and the stopping of hostilities by all fighting groups. And second, he indicated that all parties are bound by international law and no parties above international law. So the UN Security Council, the UN General Secretary's position, I think, indicated a very strong position with respect to protection of civilians and the protection also of Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza, in terms of their needs for human rights being protected, so access to water, electricity, etc. But the other thing is, which is interesting, is a few days later you had the head of the United Nations in New York, the Office of the United Nations in New York, resign, and in a public letter, very unprecedented again, very open, indicated that there was a failure by the UN, a systematic failure by the UN to actually prevent mass atrocities, and that this had to do with the fact that the UN as an institution has been hijacked and taken over, particularly by Western powers, the UK, the United States, and that this has made the protection of civilians within conflict areas problematic, particularly in Palestine, because it is politically expedient to allow the death and destruction of civilians. So you see those two messages. And I think on one level, the Secretary General's position is very strong and unprecedented, very important. He's also been to the Rafah crossing on the Egyptian side to try to pressure and allow convoys of humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. But at the other level, you have an institutional failure, and the indication of that institutional failure by a 30-year professional, a lawyer, a humanitarian lawyer, and that resigned in order to point out why the UN has failed time and time again with respect to protecting civilians in conflict areas.
And how about the UN Security Council, which itself has a non democratic structure? But few nations have a right to call off any decision made by the rest of the nations.
If you go to the United Nations website, you may see a phrase that says that democracy is a core value of the United Nations. And yet, if you look at this democratic nature, the United Nations divided between a General Assembly that has all members and a Security Council that has a very few select members. And so the General Assembly that consists of all members, majority of countries in the world, can vote, can discuss, but it doesn't matter. The power in the United Nations is vested in an old colonial arrangement in the Security Council. So that's one, is this bifurcation. The second element is this idea of veto power. So a few selected countries, again, are given the power to block any type of action depending on their own national interest, not a common principle or standard. And so this is, again, very anti-democratic. Lastly, it's actually really remarkable to see the composition of the Security Council, which consists of primarily small countries with very small populations that are not representative of the globe. So you'll see, for instance, a country like Pakistan, for over 100 plus million population, is not represented in the Security Council, but a country like France with about 80 million is. Pakistan has never colonized any country, but the France, which continues processes of colonialism, is actually tasked with maintaining international law while it actually is a flagrant violator of international law. So the double standard, the hypocrisy, and really the way in which the UN system has been designed after World War II has one way of seeing not just as undemocratic, but it actually has been very ineffective in maintaining law and order, maintaining peace, and bringing some sort of equality as well to the relationships between nation states.
Professor, why United States consistently has a policy of being savior of Israel at the UN?
So Israel is a small country, both geographically in terms of population. Perhaps on its own, it's not as significant a player on an international stage, but it is a key ally of the most powerful, arguably, country, and so the United States, and that gives it a certain boost. In terms of the violation of international law and UN violations, Israel is really a champion when it comes to violation of UN resolutions and international law. And so, just to give you an illustration, the process of collective punishment. So, for instance, in the current conflict, there's 2.3 million Palestinians within a place called Gaza, which is considered one of the largest, if not the largest, open air prison ever in history. And so, this process of collective punishment, controlling the airspace, controlling the entry point. In fact, the process of collective punishment, as described by Israeli officials, was to put the Palestinian population in Gaza on a diet, right, to control what they eat, how much they eat, to make them suffer and scream in order to achieve certain types of political objectives. That's a violation of Geneva Conventions, specifically Article 33. That's collective punishment. And you see that again. Settlements, the process of settlement itself, which is at the root, by the way, land dispossession and inequality, depending on race or identity in this region, is a violation of international law, right? So settlements themselves have been paid for, have been allowed, have been facilitated by the European Union, by the United States, economically speaking. And so the violation of these international laws, Amnesty International, Human Rights Organization, the European Commission in the 1980s found that settlements are illegal and against international law. So any normal country would be held accountable. And so there's been a very long process, literally half a century, where the protection of Israel, particularly by the power of the United States, has allowed a level of impunity and unaccountability. And if you ask why, it's very complex. There's several reasons why. There could be a cultural reason. So, for instance, if you look at some of the most powerful backers of, of Israel, they happen to be settler colonial societies, such as the United States, such as Australia and Canada. In fact, in the recent war, you'll hear that what is happening in terms of this brutal attack on civilians, Palestinians, is analogous to, for instance, what the United States had done with respect to the indigenous populations in the Americas, right? So one is this cultural element. The second element is the geostrategic importance of Israel. Israel is actually a very, very important base of US power that allows it to project that power in the Middle East and West Asia as well. So those are some of the reasons, very few, but there's more as well, that actually explains consistent US behavior with respect to supporting it in the UN.
Tell us about Brazil's resolution and also the resolutions that have been presented or are under consideration by China and Russia. How these big powers are looking into this conflict.
So the Brazilian government proposed a very popular resolution, particularly after the horrific incident in which there was an attack on a hospital of about 500 plus um, civilians had been killed in that airstrike on the hospital in Gaza. And so the Brazilian resolution first had the condemnation of all forms of violence against Palestinian and Israeli civilians. A second element that is called for an immediate ceasefire of the hostilities. And the third element that's very important is it allowed unimpeded access to humanitarian goods. And we're talking the basics of life, water, electricity, medicine. And interestingly, it also called for the protection of medical personnel, of journalists, of civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, etc. And so this was very popular. And if you look at the vote, it's actually very interesting. And this brings again the question of the democratic nature or not of the UN. Within the General Assembly, you had 120 countries vote in favor of the resolution. You had 45 abstain, and you had 13 that were against the resolution. They torpedoed the calls for a ceasefire, right? So these 13 countries obviously include Israel, one of them, US, but very, very large countries, and I say it with a grain of salt here, of Micronesia or the Marshall Islands or Papua New Guinea. So if you ask, where was China? Where was Pakistan? Where was India? Where was Nigeria? Large, important countries that represent the global south, they were voting in favor and of immediate ceasefire, a stop to the bloodletting and the killing, right? So that's within the General Assembly. In the Security Council, it was a very close 12 to 15 vote in which the veto was the US. And the reasons that was given for the veto, that means the ceasefire should not hold. There should be a continuation of this one-sided, really, of well-armed military that is attacking, for the most part, civilians in a very small confined area, right, within the Gaza Strip. So the reason that was given was to let diplomacy continue, to let diplomacy continue. And we can talk about what the nature of that diplomacy actually entails. The positions of China and Russia is very interesting because, of course, they call, just like the majority of the world, for an immediate ceasefire. And, of course, a condemnation of all violence against Palestinian and Israelis. So that's also, again, widely shared. But they also call for a two-state solution, which is a very long held solution to this problem when we look at Israel and Palestine. And that itself is also very problematic because one of the key violations, UN violations, United Nations violations that Israel engages in, is the violation against apartheid. So the definition of Israel's actions as apartheid, not really controversial. The former president, Jimmy Carter, is very open and expressed that and written in his book as well. And so this is not necessarily a controversial issue. So the call for a two-state solution is actually long gone. In fact, what happens after this conflict is actually a very big question. So China and Russia's position in terms of that is in terms of the solution is still outdated, I would say. But in terms of the immediate need for the protection of civilians and the stopping of war, it's very much in the global consensus.
Professor, Biden has asked Congress to bankroll this manslaughter. What's your take on that?
It's a consistent behavior. If the US had called for a ceasefire, we may not have the death toll of continuing 8,000 plus civilians. The US has enormous leverage over Israel. It's very important to understand that. It's not the other way around. And so the Biden administration's decision to ask for funding for Israel, again, a very developed country that doesn't necessarily need US resources, is also very indicative, again, of the relationship. So there's several things that are being provided to Israel at this time. One is munitions. So one of the sort of support that the U.S. and the Biden administration is giving is actually weapons and munitions, artillery, etc. And the other element is the protection, right? So several carriers that have been put in the Mediterranean, warning of any actors, whether it's Egypt or Lebanon or Syria or any other actor in the region, from acting to help and stop this type of continuing massacre. And aside from that, the funding mechanism as well, that is kind of unanimous. So the American political class is unanimous in supporting funding and continuation of this unfolding, I would say, ethnic cleansing. And it's really interesting to see the reaction again of both the Israeli and the US administration in the face of incredible levels of public mobilization around the world. So if you see the temperament towards outright, even worse forms of violence that you see, it partly comes from the power of the public in country after country, including the United States, that are calling for ceasefire and protection of civilians.
Thank you very much, Professor Beniam Awash, for being a guest on our show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with second segment of the program. Stay with us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Since this is a Middle Eastern crisis, I invited an expert from Middle East as well. His name is Natheer Moaid, and Natheer Moaid is an expert of Middle East, originally an Iraqi, and talks frequently about the conflicts of Middle East. Natheer, welcome you to the show. Tell us first about the public sentiment at large in the Arabian Peninsula, how the Arabs are feeling about this conflict.
Well, the sentiment of the vast majority, not only of the Arab world, but the whole Islamic world, is with the Palestinian resistance in all its forms. Despite the difference in ideologies, in political opinions, we find that all the peoples in the Arab and Islamic world have begun to defend the position of the resistance movements in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. The only exception is the political regimes that continues to act under pressure from the great powers of the Western world.
While Lebanon has been attacked this time, was Lebanon actually provoking Israel and was looking for some trouble?
Because Lebanon contains a party that possesses and continues to be a threat to the Zionist regime. Basically, it is Hezbollah. And currently some other organizations have also joined the Lebanese arena. That includes Al-Qassam Lebanon branch and also Al-Fajr forces, which is affiliated to the Islamic movement in Lebanon. And in the last few days, we have seen hundreds of Zionist soldiers killed and injured by missiles launched from areas in southern Lebanon.
Now tell us about the political situation at large in Lebanon as well. We understand there are some differences between the government and Hezbollah, which in times look stronger than the state.
As usual, Lebanon is an unstable country and its people are divided into many sects and political opinions. The country have faced severe economic crisis recently, which made the public masses less attached to their politicians. And this gives Hezbollah an opportunity to remain in control of the scene in Lebanon.
Natheer, can you further explain the problems or the differences that we have between Hezbollah and the government of Lebanon, and how does it affect the larger picture of the country as well?
The government in Lebanon is a complex of from the most of the political components, but generally it is not in favor of Hezbollah, as the government feels that the party, Hezbollah party, is a state inside the state, and the military power of the organization is so strong that it cannot be controlled by the state.
When we talk about Hezbollah, it's not possible to discard Iran from this situation. So how would Iran be thinking about Hezbollah's involvement or Hezbollah's direct involvement into this conflict?
Hezbollah is a main component of the Iranian bloc in the region. And any threat to Hezbollah is a direct threat to Iran. The Cold War between Iran and the Zionist regime reached its peak recently. Iranian atomic program shape a threat to the Zionist regime, and they, along with their allies, the Americans and the Western countries, some of the Western countries, they put a lot of pressure on politically and economically on Iran in the shape of sanctions. Mossad killed some senior Iranian scientists recently, and also they attacked military factories and workshops inside Iran. The observers expect that Iran will not allow the escalate of the Zionist regime power in the region.
Where do you expect this war will go eventually? Do you feel this to be a short-term crisis, or do you think this war will continue for some time?
Regardless the situation in Gaza, the overall situation turned over the Zionist regime. We can see that huge numbers of Western countries' citizens have stopped supporting the Zionists. Even many politicians, members of parliaments in the UK, in the United States of America, in Spain, in Canada, and other countries, they are standing against the continuous of support to the Zionist regime. Also, countries like Chile, like Colombia, they called their ambassadors from the Zionist state. So we can see that the world is changing. The Americans are not the only and unique policeman of the world. Also the Russian-Ukrainian war have also left its shadows on the conflict between the Palestinians and the Zionists as well.
Most importantly, Nazeer, where does Egypt stand in this crisis? Gaza is a former part of Egypt, and Israel largely is thinking about taking these 2.2 million people to be pushed out in Egypt. Where is Egypt's government? Why are they not overwhelmingly responding to such catastrophic crisis?
Egypt, unfortunately, is not playing a positive role towards Gaza. From one side, it is bound by peace agreements with the Zionist regime, and from another side, it has restricted its role by the ideological disagreements with Hamas. Egypt only sees Hamas as a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is currently banned and fought against by the current government in Egypt, led by General Sisi. The current situation in Gaza have put Egypt and all the Arab leaders on stake. In the same time, Egypt cannot afford hosting this large number of refugees inside Egypt. That's why they announced many times recently that they will not allow this to happen, and the borders will remain closed for refugees.
Thank you very much, Nazeer, for being guest on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join you back with last segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The last guest in the show is joining us from the South American continent. Her name is Maria Zuppello. Maria is a Brazilian journalist and speaks about the issues of Latin America. I welcome you to the show, Miss Maria. Maria, tell us about the Brazil's resolution at the UN.
Brazil prepared a resolution when it was in the rotating presidency of United Nations Security Council. After the attacks, the Hamas attacks against Israel, Lula criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu of carrying out attacks without taking into account of the women and the children of Gaza. Don't forget that Brazil doesn't recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. So it allows it to be in the position to be a negotiator. It is what Lula want to do. The problem is that the resolution was rejected because the critical point was the lack, was the fact that the resolution didn't recognize the right of Israel to defend itself. So that's why United States vetoed it. You have to understand that the Gaza issue in Latin America has a bigger framework, and the framework has something to do with the Latin American role in the BRICS groups. As you know, we have some countries like Brazil, China, Russia, and Iran want to join the group. And Lula, in his foreign policy, in his third mandate, wanted to be a friend of Iran, is a friend of Russia. So it's the multipolar world that we are talking about, the South world. So the United Nations Security Council resolution, as you know, called for humanitarian pauses, and Lula want to continue in this direction. But we don't know now with China what's going to happen. Brazil will be crucial also, and we will see later, for the presence in the region, in the country, of Hezbollah cells that could be ready to activate it again against Israeli targets in Latin America, and also Israeli targets in the United States. So as you can see, Latin America is far away from the Gaza conflict, but is inside the issue. Don't forget that a few days ago, Bolivia decided to cut off its diplomatic relationship with Israel. Then it was the turn of Chile, which is home to the largest Palestinian community outside the Arab world. It's important to stress it. And Gabriel Boric, the president of Chile, recalled, along with Colombia, its ambassador in Israel for consultations. Boric accuses Tel Aviv of not complying with international law, while its foreign ministry has made it known that it's pushing for a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinian territories.
And how are the other countries in South American continent thinking about or planning about or perceiving about this conflict?
We have a diaspora, sure. We have a huge diaspora, Palestinian community in Chile, the biggest outside the Arab world. We have around 30,000 Lebanese living the triple border between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. And in Venezuela, We have a relevant and significant community, but the problem with Venezuela is that the government opened the door to Iran and Hezbollah to set up their facilities, their activities. They are selling weapons, drones. So there is a profound relationship that is not only political, is military, is even, I would say, terroristic, because there were some evidences, for example, in Margarita Islands, of people operating for Hezbollah. And there are a lot of papers focused on it, so it's not new. But what could be new now is the approach. If the majority of Latin American countries will embrace this violent wave of anti-Semitism and pro-Hamas approach, because don't forget that the issue is that Hamas is not recognized as a terrorist organization in Latin America. It's only in Europe, United States, but in Latin America, no. And the same is for Hezbollah. I mean, there are only few countries that accepted to recognize it as a terrorist organization, which means that authorities are limited in their wave of controlling the network, the criminal network, because as you know, Hezbollah in Latin America use the criminal network, the local criminal network of drug trafficking, money laundering to fuel the terrorist operations in the Middle East. So Latin America is a kind of ATM.
So do you think Hezbollah has got a very important role in this conflict at large?
It's $1 billion questions. As you know, in the next hours, Hezbollah leader Nasrallah is expected to break the silence and to get a speech. And we don't know if his speech would be just a grandstanding or a precursor of a 2006 style Israel-Lebanon war. So what we should expect? A member of Hezbollah parliamentary bloc, Loyalty to the Resistance, Hassan Fadallah, say that Nasrallah stays silent only to confuse Israel. But this doesn't mean that this silence prevent him to pilot a new strategy from the shadows. Recently, Hezbollah declared that it sees itself as a part of the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. It has threatened to intervene with Israel when Israel ground force entered Gaza. And for sure, a second front in northern Israel is likely. Also, as I told you, Hezbollah could add pressure on Israel and on the United States by launching terror attacks abroad. Don't forget that Hezbollah is not Lebanon. I mean, the Lebanese political establishment and also public opinion is totally against the war. And at the same time, we need to take into consideration some factors. For example, the presence of United States aircraft carriers in the region. I would say the Iran's desire not to risk both of its Hamas and Hezbollah deterrence at once. And also the deep divisions inside Iran on a regional war. What could be the conditions in which Hezbollah would start? Maybe the destruction of Hamas. The destruction of Hamas could lead to Hezbollah fearing its survival. Another point is the Israeli bombings of Lebanon could push Hezbollah to start a war. But really, it's a 1 billion question.
And lastly, Maria, how Hezbollah become an important player in the Latin American continent?
There is an analyst that is my friend who wrote, in the land of symmetrical war, the asymmetrical warrior is king. And it's what really Hezbollah is doing here in Latin America. For decades, Hezbollah built a global network, engaged in illicit financial activities and supported terrorist plots. Don't forget the attacks in Argentina in 1992, 1994, where dozens of people died, the army attacks and the Israel embassy attacks, operated technically by Hezbollah members under the mastermind of Iran. So they have operatives, they have sleeping cells that could be awake because of the conflict. Don't forget that recently, for example, in 2014, Peruvian authorities detained Mohamed Amdar, who was an Hezbollah agent, who was in Peru to prepare an attack. But unfortunately, in Peru, Hezbollah is not recognized as a terrorist organization, so was only prosecuted on immigration fraud. In 2017, we have another guy, his name is Samer El-Debek. He tried to target facilities in Panama and also the Panama Canal, and so on. We have in 2021 Hezbollah operatives that tried to assassinate US and Israeli nationals in Colombia. So you have a background that could be crucial in this moment to polarize the world, to create an asymmetric war far away from Gaza, but inside Latin America, probably to attack the United States. We don't know.
Thank you very much, Maria, for being guest in our show.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Maria Zuppello, our last guest in the show. And before we close the show, I'll just say one sentence. With each day of inaction by we, the mere bystanders in this conflict, our hands are getting soaked in the blood of innocent children. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.